10 years ago, my father carried my duffel bags out to the curb with his own hands and told the neighbors, loud enough for the whole cul-de-sac to hear, that only failures enlisted in the military. He wrapped his arm around my sister that same afternoon, beaming about her acceptance letter to medical school, and told me I had exactly 1 hour to get off his property before he called the police and reported me as a trespasser. A decade later, I was standing at the back of a country club ballroom that smelled like lilies and old money, watching that same sister marry a man my entire family had built into a legend, a decorated combat veteran, they said, a self-made defense contractor worth more than the house I grew up in. When my father finally noticed me in the crowd, he stormed over and demanded to know what a disgrace like me was doing at his daughter's wedding. My sister screamed that I hadn't been invited. Her groom snapped his fingers at the security guards and ordered them to drag me out like a stray animal that had wandered in off the street. I didn't move. I didn't raise my voice. I opened a thin manila folder stamped with a federal case number, looked the groom directly in his suddenly uncertain eyes, and asked him one simple question. "Did you really think I wouldn't recognize your real name, Gregory?" His face went the color of old paper. "My name is Tessa Lang. I am 30 years old, and I currently hold the rank of Staff Sergeant in the United States Army, assigned to a unit that specializes in criminal investigations. This is the story of how the family that threw me away 10 years ago ended up needing me to save them from losing everything, and how I learned, walking out of that ballroom, that the people who discard you rarely deserve the version of you that comes back." I was 20 years old the day my life split into a before and an after. It was late spring, the kind of golden, insufferably pleasant afternoon that made my father's neighborhood look like a magazine spread, clipped hedges, sprinklers ticking in lazy arcs, somebody 2 doors down grilling steaks for a graduation party that wasn't mine. I was standing in the front hallway of the only house I had ever lived in, holding a thick manila envelope with the United States Army's insignia stamped on the corner. Inside it were my enlistment papers, freshly signed, still warm from the recruiter's printer. I had rehearsed the conversation with my father a dozen times in the car on the way home. I thought if I explained it calmly, discipline, purpose, a path built entirely on my own effort instead of his money, he might at least listen. He didn't listen. He snatched the envelope out of my hands, scanned the first page like it was contaminated, and threw it onto the floor. "Only failures and dropouts join the military," he said. His voice wasn't loud at first. It was worse than loud. It was flat, final, the tone he used when a decision had already been made and arguing with it was pointless. Then it rose, cracking across the hallway loud enough that I heard the neighbor's dog start barking through the open window. "You are throwing your entire life away, Tessa. And as long as you insist on wearing that uniform, you are not welcome in this house." Behind him, my younger sister Chloe stood on the staircase with a glass of champagne she had no business drinking at 19, still glowing from the acceptance letter that had arrived that same morning. A spot in a prestigious medical school's early program, guaranteed, practically hand-delivered on a silver platter, thanks to a family friend on the admissions board. She wasn't crying. She wasn't even uncomfortable. She was smirking, sipping her champagne like my exile was simply the opening act of her own coronation. I didn't argue. I didn't beg. Something in me had already understood, standing in that hallway, that begging would only confirm every low opinion my father held of me. I walked upstairs, packed what I could fit into 2 duffel bags, and by the time I came back down, my father had already thrown the rest of my belongings onto the front lawn. Shirts scattered across the grass, a shoebox of photographs split open near the mailbox, my high school diploma frame cracked on the sidewalk where it had landed corner first. I picked everything up in silence while the neighbors pretended not to watch from their windows. I did not cry, not there, not with an audience. I saved that for the bus station 3 hours later, alone on a bench under a flickering light, when the adrenaline finally wore off and the reality of having no home to return to settled into my chest like a stone. I remember sitting on that bench replaying the entire scene on a loop, trying to find the moment where I could have said something different, done something different, been someone different enough to keep my place in that house. I couldn't find one. My father's love had never been unconditional to begin with. I had simply never been forced to notice the conditions until I finally broke one of them. That night, I made myself a promise. I was never again going to let my worth depend on a man whose love came with a price tag and a dress code. I was going to build a name for myself that owed nothing to the Lang family fortune, and one day, I was going to make sure nobody could look at me the way my father had looked at me on that lawn, like I was something he needed to scrape off his shoe. The army did not care about my last name, my father's law firm, or the country club where he golfed every Saturday. It cared about whether I showed up, whether I could carry my own weight, literally, on 12-mile rucks through mud that swallowed my boots, and whether I could be trusted when it mattered. For the first time in my life, respect was something I earned in measurable, undeniable increments, instead of something withheld from me as a form of control. Basic training broke me down in ways I hadn't expected and rebuilt me in ways I desperately needed. I learned how to function on 4 hours of sleep, how to hold formation while a drill sergeant screamed inches from my face, how to trust the person next to me with my life because the mission demanded it. I found, buried somewhere under all that exhaustion, a version of myself that was sharper, steadier, and infinitely more capable than the girl who had once needed her father's approval to feel like she mattered. Years passed in deployments and schools and promotions. I found my calling in military criminal investigations, a career field that rewarded exactly the traits my father had once mocked in me: stubbornness, a refusal to accept the easy answer, an eye for the tiny inconsistency that everyone else walked right past. I learned to read people the way other people read books. I learned that liars are rarely undone by big mistakes. They're undone by small ones, the details they think nobody else will ever notice. My first real case as an investigator involved a supply sergeant who had spent 2 years quietly funneling equipment off the books, always in amounts small enough to blend into rounding errors, always covered by paperwork that looked flawless to anyone who wasn't specifically trained to look for the seams. It took me 11 days of cross-referencing shipping manifests against warehouse logs to find the single transposed serial number that unraveled the entire scheme. I remember the exact feeling of that moment, not triumph exactly, but a kind of quiet, settling certainty, the sense that I had built a skill nobody could take away from me and nobody had given me for free. That feeling became the thing I chased for the next several years, case after case, each one teaching me a little more about how deception actually works, not as one dramatic lie, but as dozens of small, boring, almost forgettable ones, stacked carefully so nobody bothers counting them. By the time I made staff sergeant, I had worked cases involving forged travel vouchers, falsified training records, and at least 2 other instances of stolen valor. Men who had never deployed claiming combat decorations at job interviews and family gatherings, banking on the fact that almost nobody outside the military actually knows how to read a uniform. I didn't think much about those cases once they closed. I certainly never imagined I'd end up applying that exact expertise to a wedding photograph clipped from a regional lifestyle magazine, sent to me by an aunt who still, quietly, believed I mattered. I rose to staff sergeant. I earned decorations I never once mentioned at a dinner party because I hadn't earned them for anyone's approval. Back home, life apparently continued exactly as I'd expected it would without me. Distant cousins and old family friends occasionally passed along updates, usually through my Aunt Evelyn, the only relative who had never fully agreed with my father's decision to erase me. Chloe finished her residency and became, in my father's words to anyone who would listen, the daughter who actually amounted to something. She built a life exactly along the lines my father had always mapped out for both of us: the right hospital, the right social circle, the right kind of visibility at the right charity galas. I heard about all of it the way you hear about weather in a city you no longer live in, distantly and without much feeling. Then 2 years ago the updates changed shape. Chloe was seeing someone, not just anyone, a man named Richard Vance, who my father described, in increasingly breathless terms over increasingly frequent phone calls to relatives, as exactly the kind of man this family deserves. Richard was, according to the story that spread through my extended family like wildfire, a retired major who had served with distinction overseas before pivoting into defense technology consulting, a man who drove cars that cost more than most people's houses and who spoke about troop movements and classified programs with the easy confidence of someone who had genuinely lived that life. My father reportedly told half his golf club that his future son-in-law was a true patriot, pointedly adding, more than once, that it was a shame his own daughter in uniform hadn't amounted to the same kind of rank or recognition. I let that comment roll off me the way I'd trained myself to let most things roll off me. My medals weren't bought at a charity auction or handed to me because I looked good in a dress uniform at a gala. They were earned in places my father would never have to think about, doing work he would never fully understand. I told myself I didn't need him to understand it. But something about Richard Vance's story kept snagging at the back of my mind, the way a loose thread catches on a fingernail. Careers like the one being described, decorated combat officer, high-level defense consultant, that particular blend of classified mystique and lucrative civilian payoff, don't usually move as fast, or as publicly, as his seemed to be moving. People who actually carry that kind of record tend to be quieter about it, not louder. I filed the feeling away and didn't think much more of it. It wasn't my family to worry about anymore. Or so I told myself. 3 weeks before the wedding, a thick cream-colored envelope arrived at my apartment, embossed with a monogram I didn't recognize and postage from a city I hadn't lived in for a decade. It wasn't from my father. It wasn't from Chloe. It was from Aunt Evelyn, the one person in my family who had quietly kept my mailing address updated for 10 years without ever telling anyone else she had it. Inside was a formal wedding invitation I had never officially received, Chloe Lang and Richard Vance, requesting the pleasure of my company, at a ballroom I'd only ever seen in photographs of other people's parties, along with a folded page torn from a glossy regional lifestyle magazine. A short handwritten note was clipped to the top in Evelyn's careful cursive. You should see this before the wedding. Something about him has never sat right with me. I don't know what to do with that feeling, but I trust you'll know better than I do. The magazine feature was titled, in looping gold script across the top of the page, Society's Golden Couple, Heiress to Wed Decorated War Hero and Tech Visionary. Beneath the headlines sat a full-page photograph of Chloe in a designer gown, her arm looped through Richard Vance's, who stood in a formal military dress uniform absolutely covered in ribbons and medals, his jaw set in the kind of practiced, camera-ready expression that photographs beautifully and means nothing. To almost anyone looking at that photo, he would have looked like exactly what the caption claimed. A retired major, a combat veteran, a man whose sacrifices had earned him every inch of the glamorous life laid out beside him. But I wasn't almost anyone. I had spent a decade learning to read a uniform the way a forger's handwriting gets read by someone trained to catch a fraud, and the moment my eyes moved across that photograph, every instinct I'd built over 10 years of investigative work started screaming at once. His ribbon rack was a mess. Medals that should have been reserved for extraordinary valor were pinned below basic service ribbons that every service member receives simply for showing up. A sequencing error no legitimate officer with a decade of service would ever make, because federal order of precedence isn't optional, it's practically muscle memory by the time you've worn the uniform that long. His branch insignia belonged to a specialty that had nothing to do with the combat badge pinned proudly on his chest. 2 pieces of the uniform that, worn together the way his were, told 2 completely different and mutually exclusive stories about his career. And his unit patch, the one detail civilians never notice and imposters almost always get wrong, was sewn on backward. None of that was a matter of taste or personal style. It was the uniform equivalent of a signature that didn't match the one on file. A knot formed low in my stomach and stayed there. Stolen valor is a federal crime, and depending on the circumstances, it can also be the opening move of something far more dangerous. Men who fabricate decorated military careers rarely do it for the compliments alone. They do it because a fake uniform is one of the fastest, most trusted-looking disguises a con artist can put on. It opens doors, softens skepticism, and makes wealthy, trusting families like mine hand over their savings without asking the questions they'd normally ask a stranger. I sat with that magazine clipping in my lap for a long time that night, weighing whether this was truly my business anymore. Then I thought about my father's voice on that golf course, bragging about the son-in-law who had actually amounted to something, and I thought about Chloe standing on tee. He staircased a decade ago with a champagne glass in her hand, and I decided that whatever this man actually was, my family deserved to know the truth before they handed him a marriage certificate, and with it, legal access to everything they owned. The next morning, I used my authorized access to military personnel and service records to pull the file on a retired Major Richard Vance. The search returned nothing. No enlistment record, no deployment history, no discharge paperwork, not a single trace of the man in any database that a real veteran of his claimed rank and record should have appeared in dozens of times over. That absence told me almost as much as a full file would have. I widened the search, cross-referencing aliases, approximate ages, physical descriptions pulled from the magazine photo, and known patterns for identity fraud cases our unit had handled before. It took 4 days of quiet, careful work, mostly done after hours so it wouldn't interfere with my actual caseload, before the pieces started locking into place. Richard Vance did not exist. He never had. The man photographed beside my sister was named Gregory Paul Miller, a former defense logistics clerk who had been dishonorably discharged 8 years earlier after being caught embezzling funds from a military payroll system he'd been trusted to administer. He had never deployed. He had never held command. He had never earned a single one of the medals gleaming on that borrowed uniform, all of which, I later confirmed, had been purchased from unregulated military dealers online, the same sites we routinely flagged in stolen valor investigations. The deeper I dug, working through federal fraud databases, and eventually, coordinating quietly with agents at the agency already tracking a man matching Gregory's description across 2 states, the more the picture came into focus, and the more urgent it became. Gregory had active federal warrants out for wire fraud and grand larceny tied to at least 2 previous cases, wealthy families in different states who had welcomed him in as a promising, patriotic son-in-law, only to watch their savings evaporate within months of the wedding. His method was disturbingly consistent. He identified families with old money and new insecurities, families desperate for a certain kind of prestige, and he gave them exactly the son-in-law they'd always imagined for themselves. A hero, a provider, a man who made them look good at parties. Once he had their trust, he moved fast, investment opportunities, urgent capital calls, paperwork disguised in language dense enough that people signed it without reading past the first paragraph, all funneling toward accounts that would empty out the moment he decided it was time to disappear. I sat in on 2 of those briefings myself, at the agent's invitation, once I disclosed my connection to the family, and they realized I could move through the wedding itself without raising Gregory's suspicion the way an unfamiliar agent would. They walked me through case files from his 2 previous targets, a shipping magnate's family in another state who had lost nearly all of it, and a retired judge's widow who had signed over power of attorney before anyone in her family realized what was happening. Both stories followed the same quiet, patient architecture. Months of courtship, a slow accumulation of trust, small favors that made the family feel indebted to him rather than the other way around. And then, once the wedding date was locked in, a rapid, almost surgical extraction of everything he could legally reach before vanishing. Listening to those case files, I understood exactly how close my own family had come to becoming a paragraph in someone else's future investigation. My family was already deep inside that trap, and they had no idea. Working with the federal agents who had been building a case against Gregory for months, I learned that he had convinced my father to liquidate nearly $450,000 from his retirement portfolio into what was marketed as an exclusive overseas investment fund. A fund that existed only as a shell company registered in the Cayman Islands, with no assets, no operations, and no way to recover the money once it moved. He had also persuaded Chloe, using the same warm confidence that had apparently charmed an entire ballroom of skeptical society matrons, to co-sign bridge loan documents worth more than $500,000, framed to her as working capital for a defense technology contract that, like everything else about him, did not exist. The agents explained the timeline to me in stark, clinical terms that made my stomach turn. Once the marriage certificate was filed, Gregory would gain a legal foothold into the remaining family trusts that a fiancé simply didn't have. He had a flight booked out of the country less than 48 hours after the ceremony. My father, the man who had once told me that failures wore you. Uniforms was less than 3 weeks away from watching a con artist walk out with his life savings, his daughter's financial future, and the family name he had guarded so fiercely for decades. I sat with that knowledge for exactly one night. Then I picked up the phone and told the federal agents I would help them close the case at the wedding itself, where Gregory would have no warning and nowhere left to run. The morning of the wedding, I put on my Army service uniform for the first time with a purpose entirely different from any ceremony I had worn it to before. I checked every detail with the same discipline I'd bring to a formal inspection: brass buttons polished, chevrons perfectly aligned, ribbons in exact order of precedence, the same order Gregory Paul Miller had gotten catastrophically wrong. I wasn't dressing to be recognized as family. I was dressing as what I actually was: an investigator walking into the final stage of a federal case. The country club ballroom looked exactly the way I'd imagined it would from Aunt Evelyn's magazine clipping: soaring ceilings strung with delicate white lights, round tables draped in ivory linen, an orchestra tuning quietly in the corner while 200 guests in tuxedos and designer gowns murmured over champagne. I slipped in through a side entrance the wedding coordinator hadn't thought to guard, the manila folder tucked firmly under my arm, and made my way toward the back of the room just as the ceremony was winding down, and guests were beginning to mingle before the reception. The hum of conversation faltered the moment people noticed me. A woman in uniform, standing quietly at the edge of a room built entirely around old money and borrowed prestige, was not a detail this crowd was equipped to ignore. Whispers rippled outward table by table, eyes drifting from my polished boots up to my staff sergeant chevrons, then to the thick folder under my arm, as if trying to work out which one of those details didn't belong. My father spotted me near the head table, champagne glass raised mid-toast, and I watched the exact moment recognition curdled into fury on his face. He set the glass down hard enough that liquid sloshed over the rim and shoved his way through a cluster of guests to reach me, his voice already rising before he was close enough to be heard clearly. "What are you doing here?" His words cracked across the ballroom, silencing the last murmurs of conversation entirely. "You were told never to set foot near this family again. Did you actually think you could walk into your sister's wedding in that cheap little costume and embarrass us in front of everyone who matters?" Chloe appeared beside him a moment later, her veil trailing over one shoulder, her expression sliding instantly from confusion to outrage. "She wasn't invited," she announced to the room at large, loud enough that heads turned from 3 tables away. "Somebody get security, get her out of here right now." Gregory stepped forward next, positioning himself protectively beside Chloe with the same practiced, camera-ready confidence I'd seen in the magazine photograph, and looked me over with an icy, deliberately condescending stare, clearly meant to remind everyone watching exactly whose authority outranked mine in this room. "Listen here, Sergeant," he said, pitching his voice low and commanding, the exact tone of a man who had rehearsed sounding like an officer far more often than he'd ever actually been one. "This is private property, and you are disrupting my wedding. Walk away now, or I will make a call and have those stripes stripped off your sleeve before you make it to the parking lot." I didn't flinch. I let the silence stretch a beat longer than was comfortable, took one measured step closer, and allowed a small, controlled smile to settle on my face. The same expression I used in interrogation rooms, right before a suspect's story started to collapse under its own weight. "Strip my stripes," I repeated, letting the words land slowly across the frozen ballroom. That's an interesting order, coming from a dishonorably discharged logistics clerk named Gregory Paul Miller. The name hit him like a physical blow. I watched every trace of that rehearsed authority drain out of his face in real time, replaced by a hollow, ashen paleness that no amount of composure could hide. His eyes flicked once, involuntarily, toward the exits, and his weight shifted backward half a step before he seemed to catch himself. "What is she talking about?" my father shouted, red-faced with a fury that hadn't yet caught up to what he was seeing unfold in front of him. "His name is Major Richard Vance. He is a decorated officer. You are making up lies because you are bitter that your sister found real happiness." I didn't raise my voice to match his. I simply opened the manila folder and handed him the certified documents on top. "Service record inquiries, discharge paperwork, the federal warrant summary, financial disclosures tracing the shell company in the Cayman Islands, directly back to accounts controlled by Gregory Miller. Look at the records, Dad, I said, using a word I hadn't let myself use in 10 years. That man never led troops anywhere. He stole military payroll funds 8 years ago and was discharged in disgrace. Every medal on that uniform was bought online from a dealer we've flagged a dozen times before. I turned to Chloe next, who had gone very still, her eyes moving rapidly between the papers in our father's shaking hands and the man standing beside her, whose face had lost every trace of the confidence that had apparently charmed her for the past 2 years. The defense technology company he told you about doesn't exist, I said, gently but without softening a single fact. It's a shell registered offshore with no assets and no operations. He's already moved $450,000 out of Dad's retirement fund into it, and the bridge loans you co-signed last week put your name on $500,000 of debt that was never going toward any real contract. His flight out of the country was scheduled for tomorrow night, right after the marriage certificate would have given him legal access to everything else. Chloe's breath caught audibly, her hands trembling as she turned toward Gregory, her voice cracking somewhere between disbelief and desperation. "Tell her she's wrong," she said. "Richard, tell me this isn't true." Somewhere behind me, I heard a woman in a pale blue gown whisper to her husband that she'd always thought his uniform looked a little off in the photographs, if you really looked at it. The kind of comment people only ever admit to once it's safe to be right. A few tables away, one of Chloe's bridesmaids had her phone half raised before quietly lowering it again, unsure whether this was something to film or something to look away from. My father's oldest friend from the club, a retired banker who had spent the better part of 2 years congratulating him on landing such an accomplished son-in-law, stood frozen near the bar with his glass forgotten in his hand. Gregory said nothing. His jaw worked silently, sweat beading along his hairline despite the ballroom's careful air conditioning, and for the first time all evening, he looked exactly like what he actually was. A small, frightened man who had run out of road. Before he could attempt whatever excuse might have been forming behind his eyes, the side doors of the ballroom swung open, and 4 federal agents in plain clothes moved through the stunned crowd with the calm, unhurried authority of people who had been waiting for exactly this moment for months. 2 uniformed officers followed a step behind, badges catching the chandelier light, as the lead agent stepped directly in front of Gregory and produced a pair of handcuffs. "Gregory Paul Miller, you're under arrest for federal wire fraud, grand larceny, and identity theft," the agent said, his voice carrying clearly across a ballroom that had gone completely, breathlessly silent. "You have the right to remain silent." The cuffs clicked shut around his wrists, and the ballroom dissolved into chaos almost immediately. Gasps, someone's champagne glass shattering on the marble floor, a ripple of movement as guests instinctively pulled back from the center of the room. Chloe sank to her knees in her wedding gown, her sobs muffled against her hands, while my father stood frozen beside her, the certified documents trembling in his grip, his entire understanding of the last 2 years collapsing in the space of about 90 seconds. As the agents walked Gregory past the head table, he turned his head just enough to look at me one last time. Whatever composure had carried him through 2 years of borrowed medals and rehearsed war stories was completely gone. What was left was just a tired, frightened man who had run out of names to hide behind. He didn't say anything, and I didn't expect him to. There wasn't anything left worth saying. The doors swung shut behind the small procession of agents and officers, and for a long moment, the entire ballroom simply stood in silence. 200 guests trying to reconcile the wedding they had dressed up for with the arrest they had just watched happen 6 feet away from the wedding cake. The band that had been hired for the reception stood frozen near their instruments, unsure whether to keep playing the soft entrance music they'd started or pack everything up and quietly disappear, while waitstaff hovered near the kitchen doors, balancing trays of champagne nobody was reaching for anymore. I stayed exactly where I was while agents led Gregory out through the side doors, past tables of guests who had come dressed for a celebration, and were now watching a federal arrest unfold instead. Nobody moved to stop me this time. Nobody called for security. The same ballroom that had wanted me gone 10 minutes earlier now watched me. The way you watch someone who has just, without raising her voice once, rearranged everything you thought you understood about your own family. My father lowered himself slowly to the floor beside Chloe, the folder of evidence still clutched in one hand, and looked up at me with an expression I had genuinely never seen on his face before, not disappointment, not anger, but something closer to fear, the particular kind that comes from realizing how close you came to losing everything and how little control you actually had over it. "Tessa," he said, and his voice broke completely on my name, something I don't think I'd ever heard happen in my entire life. "You saved us. I was wrong. I was wrong about all of it. Please, please come home. Let us be a family again." Chloe reached a trembling hand toward me from where she knelt on the floor, mascara streaked down her face, her wedding gown pooled around her like something already discarded. "Tessa, please," she whispered. "I'm so sorry, I didn't know, I should have known." I looked down at both of them for a long moment, my father, who had thrown my belongings onto a lawn, and called me a failure for choosing a uniform over a country club membership. My sister, who had smirked at my exile from a staircase with a champagne glass in her hand, and 10 years later, ordered security to drag me out of a room I had just saved her from ruining. I felt the old ache flicker somewhere underneath my sternum, the same one that had never fully gone away, no matter how many miles or ranks or deployments I'd put between myself and that front lawn. But it didn't rise up and swallow me the way it might have 10 years earlier. I had built too much of myself since then to let it. 10 years ago, you threw my bags onto the lawn and told me only failures wear this uniform, I said, my voice steady, carrying easily across a ballroom that had gone completely still to listen. "I didn't come here today for your approval. I didn't come here for gratitude, and I'm not going to pretend an apology fixes a decade. I came because this uniform stands for something: duty and integrity and protecting people, even people who never once did either of those things for me." I closed the folder, tucked it back under my arm, adjusted my cap, and turned toward the doors without waiting for a response. I didn't look back at the wreckage of the wedding behind me, at my father still kneeling on the marble floor, at my sister's tears soaking into a gown that had cost more than most people's monthly rent. I walked out into the late afternoon sunlight exactly the way I'd walked off that lawn a decade earlier, steady, dry-eyed, and entirely certain of who I was, with or without their approval. True honor was never something my family could have handed me, no matter how badly they wanted to buy it back that afternoon. It isn't inherited, and it definitely isn't purchased at a country club. It's forged the slow, unglamorous way, through discipline nobody applauds, sacrifices nobody sees, and the willingness to stand firm in a doorway while the people who are supposed to love you unconditionally tell you that you don't belong. I think about that lawn sometimes, the shirts scattered across the grass, the cracked picture frame, the sound of my father's voice telling the whole neighborhood that failures wore uniforms. And I think about that ballroom 10 years later, the handcuffs closing around a con artist's wrists, my father's voice breaking on my name for the first time in my life. Both moments belong to me now, and I've made my peace with carrying them together. In the weeks that followed, I heard through Aunt Evelyn that the federal agents were able to freeze most of what remained of the accounts before Gregory could move it, and that my father's attorneys were working to recover as much of the retirement fund as the law allowed. Chloe canceled the lease she and Gregory had signed on an apartment neither of them, it turned out, could actually afford, and quietly went back to living with a roommate from her residency program while the case worked its way through the courts. My father called me twice more after the wedding. I let both calls go to voicemail, not out of spite, but because I genuinely didn't know yet what I wanted to say back, and I'd learned a long time ago not to speak until I did. Maybe someday I'll call him back. Maybe I won't. Either way, it will be my decision to make, on my own terms, the same way every decision about my life has been since the afternoon he threw my bags onto that lawn. So I'll leave you with the same question I've been sitting with ever since I walked out of that ballroom into the sun. If you were the one who had been thrown away, and the very people who discarded you only came looking for forgiveness after you'd already saved them from ruin, would you ever let them back in? I still don't have an answer I'm fully certain of. I'd genuinely like to hear yours.